Cześć, tutaj Tomek Kopyra z blogu blogkopyra.com. Today we'll be speaking in English because we have our guest, special guest from England, Martynem Cornellem from Zitophil blog, beer writer, beer blogger, historian, beer expert, and my Polish colleague Tomaszem Milerem, which you remember from the last year when we tried this beer. We have the last year edition iced porter barrel aged Glenmorangie edition, and today we will compare it with Jack Daniel's barrel aged. But at the beginning, I would like to ask few questions about my concerns, my things which I'm not sure if it's true or not about this history of porter, especially the English one.
Sure.
One of the case which is in many sources is that the porter was to replace three threads kind of selling beer, yeah, because there is a story that there were three different beers, and in a pub you drink a blend or mix of it, and it was really complicated. So here comes the porter brewers, and they made the same taste, but in only one cask, in only one beer. Is it true or not?
No. It's the story has been around, the three threads story has been around, that porter was invented to replace this supposed mix of three different types of beer. It's been around since 1802. When a journalist called John Feltham wrote the story, and he took some facts that he'd found, he guessed some things, he made up a few things, and he got it disastrously wrong. Unfortunately, nobody was around to correct it, because porter had been around at that point for about 80 years. So all the people that had actually been around at the beginning of porter were no longer with us. They were all dead. So nobody corrected him. And this story became the mainstream tale of what porter was and how it had developed. Literally right through to the beginning of this century. And it was only when people started digging into it a bit more and trying to find out whether or not there was any basis in fact for this story that it was discovered that actually it was completely and utterly mistaken. There was a drink called Three Threads. It was not in fact a mixture of three separate beers, but two separate beers. Very strong beer and weak beer. And they were blended together as basically a tax avoidance scam, because they didn't know how to tell the difference or measure the difference between very strong beer and strong beer. So very strong beer and strong beer paid the same amount of tax. Weak beer paid less tax. If you blended together a barrel of strong beer, very strong beer, and two barrels of weak beer, you ended up with the three barrels that were equivalent of just ordinary strong beer, but you paid less tax overall than you would have done if it had been three normally brewed barrels of strong beer. So the publicans were doing this. It was illegal, but they got away with it a lot of the time. So that's what Three Threads was. Porter was a completely different development. Porter was a way of the brewers trying to cut their costs. They were they lowered, because the taxes were going up, the cost of raw materials were going up. Britain was at war with France, as it was so frequently through the 18th and 19th centuries. Brewers were under a lot of pressure to keep their costs down and their beer affordable. So
because it was a beer for working class.
The working classes.
It should be cheap.
Yeah, working classes drank huge amounts of beer, and they would not be very happy if it was getting too expensive. So what the brewers did, first thing they do, brewers always lower the strength of the beer. But if you lower the strength of the beer, it's going to go off more quickly, so you had to add hops. So
to preserve it.
To help preserve it, because hops were originally and basically a preservative. The flavours that we now enjoy in hops, they came along later.
Side effect.
Yes. So that was the first thing. The next thing they did, they started using the cheapest malts that they could find. They were smoky malts, wood-dried malts, very smoky flavours. A lot of people didn't like those smoky flavours, so store the beer for some time and the smoky flavours would go away. So they were now having a well-hopped beer stored for a long time, and they didn't know this was going to happen. But what then happens is that the Brettanomyces yeasts in the wood, which they didn't know about again, but were ubiquitous in any wooden vessel, came out after about 6 months or so and started chewing up all the higher sugars left in the beer and producing all these lovely estery flavours and aromas, and at the same time raising the alcohol level 1 or 2% as well. And so at the end of this storage period, they were getting out a much better, much more flavour-filled beer than had gone in. So purely as a byproduct almost of them trying to cut costs, they ended up with a much better beer. This beer then proved very popular with the working classes in London, many of whom worked as what were called porters, unloading ships and loading ships, carrying goods around the streets of the city. So the beer that they now loved took their name. So that's a true origin. That's not been too complicated. That's a true origin of porter. Nothing at all to do with three threads.
Mm-hmm. But maybe after huge success of porter, three threads were no sense to make it anymore,
yeah.
And it was the reason they replace it.
Yeah,
maybe it was a market thing, not idea of replacing.
I don't think three threads was that much of a big seller anyway. Actually, if you look at the records of what was being sold in London pubs in particular at the beginning of the 18th century, the main seller was something that was known as London brown beer, and it was this London brown beer that developed into what became known as porter. Mm-hmm. So it was trying to keep the price of London brown beer down. Mm-hmm. That led to the development of porter.
Mm-hmm. So the other things what I want to ask, is it true that there were Brettanomyces in porter? And you already admitted that it was with Brettanomyces, so it needs a long aging. Yeah. And it was in our times, we should call it a bit wild beer. It develops some different flavors from the fermentation, from the Brettanomyces fermentation. Yeah. The third thing I would like to ask, is it really true that the porter breweries were even bigger or have even bigger vessels than nowadays huge multinational breweries like Tyskie, Żywiec, or Carlsberg? Is it true that they have bigger vats, bigger vessels, fermentation vessels for porter than for international lager nowadays? Yeah,
well, certainly the storage vats that they aged these beers in through the 19th century, they discovered that the larger the vessel that you stored this beer in, the better quality beer you got out, probably because you have, as you increase the cube with the volume, the surface area at the top only squares, so you're getting less exposure to oxygen. Mm-hmm. And probably other things going on there as well, but the size of the vessel seemed to affect the quality of the beer, and the bigger the vessel, the better the beer. And there was also, it has to be said, a certain amount of, mine's bigger than yours.
I've heard that when they launch new vessel or build new vessel, they make a party inside.
Yes. Yeah, it was a big thing. You get publicity in the newspaper because you'd had a party for 50 guests inside your porter storage tun. So yes, they got up to, the largest was supposed to be about 20,000 barrels
20,000 barrels, which means something like 30,000 hectoliters.
Yes, something like that. So these things were 20 or more feet high, absolutely massive. Took several years to build one of these things, with expert vat makers.
And what we've talked earlier at the Tomaszem Miler channel, that one of the reasons that Baltic Porter come to reality, it was that they need a lot of oak from Russia. From Kopyra nowadays. It's probably Lithuania, but it was Russia. Or Prussia.
It's
Maybe
Prussia.
Prussia.
I think it's Prussia, because the Kopyra it was then known as Memel. And a Memel oak was regarded as the top quality oak because it was very tight grained, so you weren't getting any real influence from the wood in the beer. And also, as we discussed, they were importing from the Baltic the iron to make the hoops to go around these vats and around the barrels, the casks, and also isinglass, because they were looking for quite a clear beer. Which is one indication that the 18th century porters were not as black as porter later became. They needed it to be quite clear, and therefore they needed to import quite a lot of large amounts of isinglass from Russia, which was the only known source.
And if they need ingredients, they on the way back. They put it beer.
That was basically it. Yeah, rather than send the ships out empty, send some beer, and it proved very popular with people in the region.
What about this story that the imperial stout porter was for Russian court, Russian Tsar?
Well, certainly there are records of English visitors to Russia who found these very strong porters on sale, and Catherine the Great is, the contemporary records of Catherine the Great supposedly importing imperial stouts. But they weren't called imperial because they went to the Russian court. They were just called imperial because they were the biggest ones that were being brewed at that time. The imperial was the real top of the range stout porter of the time.
You've mentioned that they choose this kind of oak from Russia or Prussia because there's a lack of oak wood character in beer, because that oak was very thick, because they're the small,
very tight grain in the oak.
So this is something completely different what we are looking in this beer, because nowadays we are looking for an oaky notes for small barrels after whiskey or bourbon, which they use American oak.
American oak, which is the grain is looser than in European varieties of oak. So
French oak is also used for barrels for wine,
for wine and for cognac and armagnac and our brandies. And also it's less spoken of, but also some oak from Slavonia and also from Bulgaria. So also Hungary. So the oak is sourced from various places, but definitely the most common type of oak in the spirit industry, I would even say, is Quercus alba, that is white American oak, coming from ex-bourbon barrels, which in Europe are called first fill. So if you put a Scotch whiskey into a ex-bourbon or ex-Tennessee whiskey barrel, it's called a first fill for the first time, even though, of course, the barrel or cask, if you will, held spirit before inside.
Okay, we have two iced beers, freeze distilled, or how we call it. Is it any examples of ice distilling beers in the UK, in the English brewing industry? Of course, we know that case with Brewdog, that they are chasing with the Schwarzbock about who is brewing stronger beer or this ice distilling stronger beer. But have any examples from the history of brewing that there were some?
Well, only by accident. When they were exploring continuously to try to find the Northwest Passage, as it was called, to get from Britain to Asia and to India, going around the top of Canada.
What will be possible probably in a few decades.
Yes, yeah, you can do it now, but you couldn't do it then. So they would load up with massive amounts of really, really strong barley wine type beers, not stouts and porters, but very strong, 12, 13% fruity, sweet beers to keep them going through these freezing cold. And these beers would freeze.
They would, right?
But they were so strong that they were unharmed.
Not completely.
Yeah, completely freeze, solid. But not so much that they would be harmed. But they weren't harmed by it because they were so strong. And what they discovered was that obviously, as it thaws, just as in freeze distilling, the first first bits to thaw was the most alcoholic.
Yeah.
And they discovered that this was a very delicious, very delicious drink. But they never really made anything of it. They didn't really do anything of it. And in Britain, in any case, if you are freeze distilling, you have to have a distiller's license. Mm-hmm. So most brewers couldn't be bothered to do that. So there's not really a tradition of freeze distilling at all.
Mm-hmm. Because we know it as a German tradition from Eisbock, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try the last year edition of Comes iced beer, Glenmorangie whiskey barrel aged. It was first fill, as you said, but the second use of this barrel, or third use, because first it was a Jim Beam
At that time,
barrel.
we tasted it, and it was an ex-Jim Beam, so straight bourbon whiskey barrel.
Mm-hmm.
And this, we could actually say that the types of casks, they're the same, because they're ASBs, American Standard Barrels. However, the second beer that we're going to taste was held inside a barrel that was a first fill. Before that, there was Jack Daniels. So it's a different type of whiskey, which sensory-wise is totally different. So I'm very curious to know how it impacted the beer inside.
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about this one?
Still, even after a year, there is a distinct whiskey character, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What about barrel aging? Because, of course, in the previous centuries, brewers used wooden vats, wooden barrels, but they, as you mentioned, avoiding oak notes in a beer. When we have first examples when they used barrels after whiskey or bourbon, and it was American craft beer revolution or previously?
I don't think there really wasn't much kind of secondary use in the brewing industry. The distilling industry, absolutely. Largely because the Scots were trying to save money, and you could buy cheap
and don't have forests.
And cheap second-hand barrels and casks. So they were using sherry casks originally, and then got into buying the bourbon casks and so on. The brewers didn't really do that. Again, partly because of the laws against using barrels that had previously held spirits, because you were getting the spirit that had soaked into the staves out into the beer, raising the strength of the beer, and that was illegal.
So the spirit within the wood could migrate into beer and increase ABV?
Yes. And the tax authorities said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. We're not going to allow it. So there was no reuse of spirit barrels. And I'm not aware that they were using even things like sherry or wine barrels. They didn't want those flavours At that time, they didn't want the flavours in the beer. Aging the beer, oh yes, definitely. And you see from almost the moment that hops started being used in British brewing, certainly from the beginning of the 17th century, there was almost a competition to see how long you could age your beer, particularly among the kind of country house brewers, the aristocratic brewers, who were all brewing for the workers on their farms. And periodically, they would brew really, really strong beers and age them for unbelievable periods of time. So there are
For
records.
example?
Well,
How long is long?
20 years, 21 years.
Okay.
People would.
What about evaporation?
Well, now this is an interesting thing because they were probably doing a Solera thing. So they were adding all the time fresh beer and probably fresh hops as well. So these big, not as big as the porter brewers were using, but big casks of maybe 10 barrel size, 15 barrel size. What they would do is, Lord so and so on his stately home, he would have his firstborn son arrived, and that autumn they would brew a really, really strong beer up around 12, 13, 14%.
And then they would age it for the wedding.
They would for his 21st birthday.
21st.
His coming of age.
Okay.
And then there would be a huge party, and they would broach this beer, and everybody would say, "Well, this is fantastic," whatever. And this was really quite common.
We have a similar tradition in Poland with spirits called starka.
Oh, of course, you can do it with Baltic porter. If you are not a brewer, but if you are a home brewer, for example, you could brew a really potent beer like barley wine, imperial stout, or Baltic porter and keep it for 18 years. But you can, if you are not a brewer, you can buy a range of Baltic porters from the year of birth of your child and keep it for 18 years. I think it's quite interesting idea.
Guys, I want to say two things. First of all, I don't know how many minutes of the conversations, but of this conversation, but it already put two things for me in my life into different perspective. First thing is a spectacular event. If you have a party for 50 and a beer storage tank, then I don't know if I ever participated in a spectacular event. That's one. And the other one is that in the video that we did for my channel, we were discussing about full flavor and how a Baltic porter is a full flavored beer. I'm drinking this one, and the full flavorness of it is just almost incredible.
Yeah.
The flavor is so intense that it really sticks to the palate. It stays over. Really interesting.
What is interesting, because there's ice distilled beer, and there's a law that the excise tax is paid from the extract, not from the ABV. So they have to calculate the theoretical extract. And it was 47.
Whoa.
So it's like Jopen beer. Like your pace.
But the Jack Daniel's expression is the same, the extract?
No. Here we have 20% ABV and 47% of extract, Plato degrees. And here we have 36 degrees Plato and 15% of alcohol.
That does not taste like a 20%.
Exactly, I wanted to ask. I think the 20% is quite well hidden within the flavor, with the intensity.
And I'm not really getting an
Oh, okay. So first
This
thing,
is completely different beer.
Completely different beer, yes. So I was wondering about that. Because Glen Moray, of course, it comes from ASB also later. Maybe it was converted.
But the beer before barrel aging was completely different. Yeah, because they firstly freeze the water and put it out, and then put the ice beer put in a barrel to barrel aging. So the base beer, if we can call it in that way, was different, was weaker.
Tomek, what would you say is the leading aroma note here? First thing that's on your nose.
I think that's vanilla.
Vanilla, 100%, I would say the same.
Yeah.
And this is very consistent with what it theoretically should be. Because for
it's
American
bourbon.
whiskey with a virgin oak and all the charring and all the vanillin going into the whiskey and being in the cask, it's definitely there. So I was thinking about it. Would that be so different? Would it be easy for me, a person that's not experienced in the world of beers, to differentiate between those two beers? And it appears it's very easy.
Yeah,
because
it's
beer is
very
totally
prominent.
different, yeah.
It's very different. Very distinct differences between these two beers. Unfortunately, after this very, rich and
I would invert the lineup.
Yeah.
I would start with Jack Daniels first and then the Glenmorangie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is
Chocolatey,
this is very vanilla-like, but less body.
less body. yes,
Definitely
yeah.
less body.
But I don't think that for ice beer we could call it medium bodied. It's still very.
Yeah,
I think,
but
in perspective
that-
of the
that-
first
that-
one,
definitely that's what you mentioned. That if we started in the different, first with Jack Daniels, there will be different
perception.
of the mouthfeel.
There's definitely more now. I'm now getting. I don't know why I wasn't getting it to begin with. There's more of an alcohol burn on this. The 20%.
In a manner of aroma, I prefer Jack Daniels, but in a manner of mouthfeel and richness, I prefer Glenmorangie.
For the Jack Daniels one, I'm really, I would say, attracted by the vanilla, and it's very, very interesting aroma. Yeah, and I am also interested to later maybe check in inverted order. So starting from Jack Daniels and going to Glenmorangie, because indeed what we call the full flavor, here the flavor is so full that it maybe puts this one in shade a little bit. I don't know. That's interesting to check.
I'm not a great fan of vanilla in drinks. I can't stand Chardonnay wine, for example, and so that's. Unlike you, that's why I vastly prefer that one to that one. That is just, for me, and this is not entirely my own personal taste because I don't like that particular flavour, not something that I would wish to spend all evening over. That I think I could happily, round off an evening having a nice glass.
I'm
of that.
definitely for Jack Daniels aroma. I think that the bourbon, vanilla, and maybe a little bit even chocolate with vanilla. Of course, it's chocolate comes from Baltic porter. For me, the aroma is great. Yeah, but comparing to this, the is lack of body. Yeah.
I think what could be interesting, especially for a whiskey fan, or maybe even for a beer fan that's just first steps in the world of whiskey, is that this beer easily translates into its origin. So into the flavor profile of Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey. Yeah.
It's a bit pity that there's not the same base beer, yeah, because
the comparison would be more accurate.
Yeah, we have there's not only barrel makes the difference. Also, the level of freezing makes the difference. Because here there is less water, more was freezed than in this beer. But on the other hand, I think that this is what you taste when you sip this beer. When you sniff, the difference is only from barrels. And then there are definitely differences that this whiskey is whiskey and bourbon is vanilla. It's definitely different, and it depends on you if you are a more bourbon or more whiskey fan, yeah, or you like this really vanilla, sweet and for me very good aroma.
Glenmorangie is a rather light whiskey, so of course this is also a very approachable aroma and flavor profile. But here indeed the vanilla is the absolutely leading note. Yes.
We have information that this Jack Daniels is in 14,000 bottles, so it will be quite easy to get. Probably easier than the Glenmoray, because that was only 4,000 bottles. But I've heard that few bottles are left in the brewery, so probably there will be some possibility to get Glenmoray edition. But this Jack Daniel's edition will be probably vastly distributed, and I think that it's really worth to try. If you could buy both and compare, remember, start with Jack Daniel's barrel aged first, because it's lighter in the body and it really change your impression if you start, because it will be rich, and after you try the Glenmoray, it will be richer, even more rich. But if you start with Glenmoray, it will be that was rich and it was not so rich. Yeah. So this is a really interesting thing, how porter from the mass-produced, maybe first macro beer at the world, comes to that specialty, which is on the same shelf as whiskey, single malt whiskey. You could put it on the shelf with the single malt whiskey. It gives you similar impressions. Yeah, it's not for drinking; it's for sipping, for tasting, sniffing, and it's fascinating. That, like, the history of this few centuries, maybe not make a circle, but goes somewhere probably no one expected.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Of course, this special edition of beer is connected with Baltic Porter Day, which we'll have in 21st of January this year. It's always third Saturday of January, and there will be many more special releases from different breweries in Poland, not only in Poland. Stay tuned, try different Baltic porters. Of course, look for Jack Daniel's barrel-aged iced Baltic porter. Of course, there's still a thing to consider to buy some regular beers, regular Baltic porters
for aging.
With the idea of aging for many years, and maybe celebrating the next year or in 5 years with one you bought in 2023. Thank you very much for your knowledge about this facts, which some of them for me was like a legends. Like we've talked about London Beer Flat at the Tomaszem Milerem episode. Of course, we invite you to visit Tomaszem Miler's channel and watch the first episode, which was previously recorded, and I hope that you enjoy both of these videos and enjoy Baltic Porter, because it's our Polish brewer's treasure.
And so it should be.
Polish brewer's treasure.
Yeah. Martin said at that previous episode at the Tomasz channel that he really regret that it's after Michael Jackson's book, it's called Baltic Porter, not Polish Porter.
I think it should be Polish Porter. Too late now, but cheers.
Na zdrowie.